Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for this this special order hour, which we have decided to devote to the life and career of an extraordinary former colleague, Ron Dellums, the giant who has fallen and whose death has deeply affected this body. So we've invited members who have reminiscences and appreciations to come forward and to participate in remembrance of the life of Ron Dellums. I just have a few things to say. I never had the good fortune of serving with Congressman Dellums, but he was a very close friend of my family, so I grew up admiring him as a little boy. He was an incredibly warm and dynamic, charismatic, and brilliant man who really exuded love of people wherever he went. And among his many extraordinary achievements in public life, one of them was to bring into politics and government service our distinguished colleague, Barbara Lee, who succeeded him in office and who will be taking over the special order hour after I say just a few words. But we should not understate the importance of that achievement. Congresswoman Lee served as his chief of staff for many years. She'll tell you that story. And then he backed her for the seat that he occupied, and so she is the proud and worthy successor to Congressman Dellums. But I wanted to say that in a professional field where so many participants are known for putting their finger up to the wind and following simply what the pollsters or campaign donors are telling them to do, Ron Dellums was a diamond in the rough from day one. He always put his ideals and his values first, and he didn't waver from them no matter how politically tough it became. He was raised in a politically engaged environment. His father was a longshoreman who was deeply involved in the labor movement, and his uncle, Cottrell Lawrence Dellums, was instrumental in helping A. Philip Randolph organize the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters before being elected president of that union in 1966. Now, Ron, when he graduated from high school, enlisted in the United States Marine Corps and spent several years in the Marines before an honorable discharge. He went on to college and to receive his master's in social work and became a psychiatric social worker in the California Department of Mental Hygiene. He was elected to the Berkeley City Council in 1967 at the age of 32, and he was deeply involved in the movement against the Vietnam War, which profoundly affected his political outlook and his development as a leader, and he was elected to Congress in 1972. I will allow my colleagues to talk about the various legislative efforts they were involved in with Congressman Dellums, but I'll say when I was in college, he was a great hero to college students across the country and to anti-apartheid activists, not just across America, but across the world, for his leadership for comprehensive sanctions against South Africa, the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986, which was passed as a culmination of a movement that he organized that involved civil disobedience at the South African embassy. And I was very proud to have played a tiny part in that as a college student, to have come and participated and submitted to arrest along with thousands of other people who did that at that time in order to galvanize public opinion against American complicity and involvement with apartheid South Africa. But I would say that one other thing that always made such a powerful impression on me was that Congressman Dellums, like another great leader for peace, George McGovern, was himself a veteran, and he saw no conflict between the two. He was someone who proudly served in the armed forces of his country and nobly did so, but thought that it was equally noble to fight for peace and to make sure that our defense budget was one that was very closely tethered to the actual military and national security needs of the country, and not one that is bloated and subject to waste and corruption and graft and embezzlement and kickbacks and so on. And that's been an historic struggle that goes back to the very beginning of our republic. We want a military that actually serves the people, that serves the republic, and is not an opportunity for other people to rip off the taxpayers. And he was very focused on making sure that our military budget was really targeted to the actual defense and security of the country, and that America was a force for human rights and security of all peoples and peace all over the world. So he leaves an extraordinary and inspiring and difficult legacy for all of us to live up to, and I'm very proud at this point to turn it over to Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who has become in her years in office also a great and famous leader for peace, human rights, and social justice.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I would first like to ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the subject of our special order tonight.
Without objection.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I rise this evening to really celebrate the life and legacy of my mentor, my former boss, and my dear friend, Congressman Ronald V. Dellums. I had the privilege to serve as an intern in Ron's Washington office during the Watergate hearings of 1974 and a senior member of his staff for 11 years. First, my deepest condolences to Ron's beloved family, friends, and our community who he loved so deeply, as we continue to come to grips, quite frankly, with the grief and the passing of this tremendous voice. Yet we honor and celebrate Ron's magnificent legacy. Let me thank Congressman Jamie Raskin for being a part of this special order tonight and for co-leading it. Congressman Raskin's father, Marcus Raskin, was a close and cherished friend of Ron's. They deeply loved and respected each other. Let me also thank all of my colleagues in the Congressional Progressive Caucus and the Congressional Black Caucus for holding this special order tonight to remember a truly historic figure, the late, great Congressman Ron Dellums. Congressman Dellums was a founding member of the Congressional Black Caucus and the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and I know the celebration of his life would mean so much to him. Ron will be remembered not only for his many accomplishments, but for his integrity and his brilliance. He was a courageous statesman, a warrior for world peace, a soldier for social justice, and a son of West Oakland. He served this country in both the Marines and in this Congress with distinction for 27 years and as mayor of Oakland for 4 years. He was beloved by his East Bay constituents, regarded by his colleagues from both sides of the aisle, and respected as a global leader. Above all else, Congressman Dellums was a visionary, and his conscience guided him in the pursuit of peace and justice and equality in all forms. I would like to now yield time to one of Ron's very close friends, a person who he loved dearly, who's an icon in his own right, someone who led the fight for our voting rights, the gentleman from Georgia, Congressman John Lewis.
My beloved friend, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, thank you for holding this special order. You know, Ron Dellums was a special human being, special leader. He was one of a kind. He was born and grew up in due season. Those of us that worked with him, that got to know him, We love him. We admired him. I can see him now saying, "Hi, bro. What's going on?" We must continue to stand up and speak up and fight the good fight. You know, Ron never gave up. He never gave in. He never became bitter. He was never hostile. He loved people. He worked so hard, tireless, for what he believed in. As you have stated so well, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, Ron was a founding member of the Congressional Black Caucus. But I tell you, he was a peaceful warrior. He believed in peace. He struggled to help build what I call a true democracy in America. He fought to build what Dr. King called the beloved community. He wanted to redeem the soul of America. He wanted to bring people together. It didn't matter whether they were black or white, Latino, Asian American, or Native American. He saw us as one people, one family, living in the same house, not just the American house, but the world house. I tell you, as one member who came here after winning an election in 1986, coming here in 1987, I would talk with Ron a great deal. I learned a great deal from him. He used his leadership of the Armed Service Committee to highlight the senseless nature of war and to press for greater investment in the public good. He fought for peace at home and abroad. As a member of Congress, he was the author of the legislation and the movement for corporate divestment in South Africa. As a political leader, he was an inspiration to people all over the world. People admired him. People loved him. You know, he was tall. He stood up. He stood out. And he spoke with passion. In his passing, the nation has lost a strong and powerful crusader for justice, for equality and peace. He was cool before it became popular to be cool. He dressed so well, and you knew Ron Dellums was coming when you saw him before he made it to you. For many of us, he was our hero. Activists of the 21st century and all of the new members of Congress who seek progressive change in America would do well to take several pages from Ron Dellums' book. It would make you a better member of this body. His voice made him a force to be reckoned with as a committee chair, as a legislator, as a leader. He insisted in his call for justice, for his cause for peace. He will be deeply missed all over America, not just in California, not just in Oakland, but all over America and around the world. For people who long for peace, for justice, for equality. Thank you, Ron Dellums, for all that you did to help make our country and make our world a better place. I yield back. Thank you, Barbara Lee.
Thank you, Congressman Lewis, for that very beautiful tribute to Ron. It was a loving tribute, and I know personally how much Ron loved you and in many ways looked up to you and respected you as a human being and your tremendous leadership. So thank you on behalf of Ron's family, friends, and our community. Now I'd like to ask Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton to come forward. Congresswoman Norton knew Ron very well, served with Ron, and Ron served as chair of the District of Columbia Committee when I was actually a staffer during that period. And they had many struggles during that day. Ron and Eleanor remained friends, and he loved you dearly, Eleanor, and always asked about you.
I thank my very good friend, Representative Barbara Lee from California, who has the great honor of serving in the seat that Ron held. And she has that honor because of her work with Ron and because those who lived in his district understood that Ron did not serve them alone. So, Barbara, I think that for you to have risen from intern to chief of staff to Ron Dellums says everything about your service in the Congress. You are just the right person to be leading this special honor for our good friend, the dapper, the brilliant Ron Dellums. You show us, I must say, that Ron had an eye for talent, and I thank you for sharing that talent now with the nation. Now, it is true that my district and I had a special relationship with Ron Dellums, and therefore I must tell you a special love. Because for 14 years he chaired the old District of Columbia Committee, which he helped me get rid of, understanding that the district deserved equality with other districts. But I have to say how fortunate we were that Ron chose to use one of his committee seats for the District of Columbia. Why would Ron Dellums do that? There's not a vote in the District of Columbia for Ron Dellums, much as people would have loved to vote for him. But there wasn't a single vote because he didn't live in the District of Columbia. This was such an unselfish human being. He went with where he thought he was needed. And I do need to tell you how unusual that is, because most members choose their committees. And this applies to his choice of the Armed Services Committee as well as the District Committee. You choose your committee because it allows you to bring home something to your constituents. I'm the perfect example. I have chosen committees which have helped me rebuild whole sections of the District of Columbia. The wharf or the southwest waterfront, the southeast waterfront, and other sections of the city. That's how most of us operate. But let me tell you something, it's hard. It's hard to bring home peace. Yet that's why Ron Dellums chose to serve on the Armed Services Committee. And he served on the District Committee, and I'll have a word to say about that, because he could not bear to see any Americans treated less than full American citizens. I must note, though, because I don't want to leave you with a parochial sense of Ron Dellums, or think I'm just here because of what he did for my district. That would be reason enough for me to be here. But I have to note the uniqueness of Ron Dellums as a member of Congress. Because not before and not since has there been a member like Ron Dellums. As a lawyer, I'm going to prove this point. I hope you will agree before I sit down. First of all, here's a Marine Corps vet. It's a pretty tough branch of government. And of course, he gave him special credibility when he became the leader of anti-war efforts in the Congress of the United States, whether House or Senate. This was the leader of anti-war efforts when we were in Vietnam and when we were in wars since. Never before or since has a member who opposed most of the mandate of a committee been elected to chair that committee, as Ron was elected to chair the Armed Services Committee. Now remember, you don't get appointed to these committees. You have got to earn enough respect from your colleagues on the committee so that they want to elect you to chair them. I defy my colleagues to find any other member of Congress who has gotten elected or could get elected chairman of a committee with a mission they oppose. This was the leading advocate for peace in the Congress, winning the votes of his colleagues to chair the Armed Services Committee, which has, I must tell you, if you will forgive me, little to do with peace. They have to do with preparing for war. I begin there to make you understand what manner of man I'm talking about. Now, he didn't just decide when he came to Congress, wouldn't this be a cute thing to do, given where I stand on these issues, to chair, to grow up, as it were, in Congress, to chair the Armed Services Committee. And he started right off where he ended. As a freshman, Ron introduced a resolution. He just got here. Introduced a resolution calling for an investigation of war crimes, or what he regarded as war crimes in Indochina. Well, of course, particularly as a freshman, that was refused. So instead of walking away, as virtually any member would, especially a freshman, he said, I'm going to call some unofficial hearings on this very subject. And he was able to lure some of his colleagues with him, despite other colleagues regarding him as an outrage in introducing the resolution in the first place. Here is a member of Congress whose reputation for fairness, whose congeniality was such that when time came to elect a chairman, many Republicans supported him to become chairman of the Armed Services Committee. Now, there was the defense establishment that was rattled. What to expect from this man? Well, this is what you got. You got leadership from a man who managed every bill to increase defense funding with great equanimity and fairness while opposing his own bills. That's what you got. Find yourself that kind of a member, much less a chairman today in the Congress of the United States. You got a man who did not, in fact, was indeed very much for equal rights for gays in the military, but ushered through his committee a ban on gays serving openly in the military. He understood the difference between Ron Dellums and Mr. Chairman. That is an important difference. And because members tend not to understand that difference, they tend not to get elected chair of a committee whose mandate they oppose. I must say, because I was not in Congress at the time of the South African movement, but indeed was a leader of that movement, how much Ron was appreciated throughout the country for his leadership as the chief sponsor of the bill that got us sanctions against South Africa for its apartheid policies, and ultimately the release of Mandela from prison. Finally, if I may say to my friend, from California, let me say a word of special thanks regarding Ron Dellums' service on the District of Columbia Committee. He served it from the moment he was in Congress, and he chaired the committee for, as I indicated, 14 years. It's interesting, here's another committee he wanted to get rid of because he was one of the first supporters for statehood for the District of Columbia when the District of Columbia was just trying to get the vote, or what we call home rule. Some of his words deserve repeating. For example, he says, "I am an advocate, not an overseer of district affairs." Now, here's a committee chairman. Clearly, he was the overseer. We didn't have the power. He did. This is how he approached his work as chair of a committee, not his district. This is how he approached giving the district the respect that it deserved. I was not a member of Congress at the time, but I know that my friend Walter Fauntleroy, who was deeply appreciated and who represented the district at the time, deeply appreciated Ron Dellums in particular. When I indicate that Ron was for D.C. statehood, you might think, well, only you're for D.C. statehood. What do you expect? Remember, we didn't have good home rule then. We didn't get that until 1994. And we were just getting to the point where people understood the inequality of the residents who live in the District of Columbia. But Ron Dellums understood you've got to advocate for what people deserve, not what step they are at in getting what the Congress wants to give them. His service as chair of the district committee was long ago, but I have to tell you it meant everything to the district to have a chairman who loved this District of Columbia as he loved his own city, who understood what the district needed and wanted, and who always consulted with the district. Yes, California is far away from the District of Columbia, but notwithstanding the distance, I stand here this evening with the greatest of gratitude for the 700,000 people I represent now and for all of those who had the great privilege of having Ron as the chair of the district committee. I stand here to thank Ron, to let him know he will be forever remembered in our city, and to let him know that he has not been and never will be forgotten by the residents of the District of Columbia. My thanks, eternal thanks, to my good friend for leading this special order.
Thank you, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, for that very eloquent statement. And let me just say to you that Ron passed away in his home here in Washington, D.C., July 30th. You were his representative. Ron loved the District of Columbia, as you said. His children went to Alice Deal Junior High and Wilson High School. And he worked with yourself as well as, if you remember, Hilda Mason, who was on the city council and a strong activist for statehood. So thank you for reminding us of Ron's wonderful history in this district. Now I would like to yield to my colleague, Congressman Hank Johnson from the great state of Georgia, member of the Judiciary Committee, Transportation and Infrastructure, but prior member of the House Armed Services Committee. Thank you very much, Congressman Johnson, for being with us tonight.
I thank the gentle lady. Madam Speaker, I express my sincere condolences to the family and friends of a great patriot, Representative Ron Dellums. My sincere condolences for your loss. It's my great honor to be here tonight to pay my respects to a man who was a true giant of this body, the United States House of Representatives, as well as in American life, a man who I think we can all say with assurance was one upon whose shoulders we all stand. Before we had the incomparable John Lewis and the inimitable Maxine Waters in Congress, there was Ron Dellums, who left us his distinct mark, not just on this August body, but the San Francisco Bay Area, the nation, and the world. He left an indelible impression upon me as a congressman. The greatest legacy that he left us, however, was his successor, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who carries on his legacy. For 10 years, I was honored and privileged to serve as a member of the House Armed Services Committee. Ron Dellums' portrait hanging in the committee room was a constant reminder of the type of committee member that I aspired to be. If being an advocate of peace, justice, and humanity toward all human beings is radical, then I'm glad to be called radical. He once said. I'll repeat that. If being an advocate of peace, justice, and humanity toward all human beings is radical, then I'm glad to be called radical. That's what Ron Dellums said. And he further stated, quote, and if it's radical to oppose the use of 70% of federal monies for destruction and war, then I'm a radical, end quote. That quote, ladies and gentlemen, has stuck with me. It has guided me in my public service. Ron Dellums would never allow the powers that be or the corrosive forces of Washington, D.C. to put him in a box. He never allowed labels to define who he was. Right-wing critics called him a communist, but Ron shot back and described himself as a, quote, commie, pinko, afro-top, bell-bottom dude from Berkeley, end quote. He was a true Renaissance man, and he was cool before Congress knew what cool was. A bell-bottom cat from Berkeley. Who other than Ron Dellums could rise from the streets of Oakland to become a congressman, a mayor, and one of the guiding forces behind a 14-year campaign against apartheid in South Africa that helped bring down that racist regime? Who else but Ron Dellums could help form the Congressional Black Caucus, and from his seat and chairmanship on the powerful House Armed Services Committee, proposed spending not for war and weapons, but instead for education, jobs, housing, health care, assistance to the poor, and programs to fight drug abuse. Ladies and gentlemen, Ron Dellums set the ultimate example for us today with the powerful message and legacy of being true to oneself, a man who stood tall for the people, and not just for the people of America. Ron stood for the people of the world. He was a unique and authentic human being, and his presence will be missed. Thank you, Ron, for your guidance and for your example that we can look to as a beacon as we make our way, moving our country forward during these turbulent times. The lessons we've learned from your example will serve us well as we continue the good fight for peace, justice, and humanity towards all human beings. Thank you, Ron Dellums. And thank you, Barbara Lee, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Congressman Johnson, for that very beautiful tribute. I know one of Ron's greatest gift was mentoring those who came after him, and I know he certainly appreciated your leadership on that Armed Services Committee and talked a lot about the great work that you were engaged in, so thank you. I would like to now ask our leader, Nancy Pelosi, to come forward, who knew Ron very well, even before Ron and Nancy served together in Congress. Thank you so much for being here and for paying tribute now.
Thank you very much, Barbara Lee, for bringing us together in the special order to honor a very, very special person, Congressman, Mr. Mayor Ron Dellums. You worked with him, so you saw close up his commitment to values to make the future better for everyone in our country. You also participated in his collaboration that when an issue arose or even was anticipated, he engaged the entire community in the discussion and the collaboration of what was best for the community, not deigning to tell them, but listening. He listened. And we all listened. When Ron Dellums came to the floor, it was an occasion. Everything stopped because we wanted to hear what he had to say, because we knew it would be substantial, but we also knew it would be eloquent and on occasions humorous. So he was an absolute star in the Congress of the United States, like no other. In the galaxy of stars here that many of us have served with, he shines so much brighter, and the world is a duller place for his leaving us. What's important about Ron are some of the things that our colleague, Mr. Johnson, referenced about apartheid in Africa and how important he was in that fight and how effective he was as a leader in that fight. When he assumed the chairmanship of the Armed Services Committee, a progressive from Berkeley, he understood that our country had to be strong. But he measured our strength not only in our military might, but the health, education, and well-being of the American people. He saw them go together. Without that piece of it, we could never really reach the potential of strength that America is about. We'll have a number of occasions, one in Oakland on Sunday to share some stories there, and then at a later date here in Washington, D.C. again, and many times in between to share stories about Ron Dellums. But I know for everyone who served with him, and he was in Congress long before I came, but I had the privilege of serving for a while, anyone who served with him considered it a tremendous honor to call him colleague, and for those of us who had the privilege to call him friend, that was a joy in our lives. As Californians, though, we took special pride in Ron Dellums. And one story that I love about him, there are many, but one that I love about him is when this is a prince. You see how elegant he is, dressed meticulously, so beautifully. But one story that he told was that the first time he went to Africa, he, proud of his skin color, proud of the community he represented and sprang from, but to be on a continent and visit countries where the leaders of the country were African, to see people who shared his ethnicity lead their countries and be respected. It was something he brought home to us with great emotion and great pride. And with great emotion and great pride, I'm grateful that I had the opportunity to serve with him. I know our time is limited on this, so I'll save some stories for Oakland on Sunday. But thank Barbara Lee again for not only bringing us together here, but for honoring the legacy of Ron Dellums in his long career as a member of Congress, honoring the values they shared, making her own mark in the Congress, and now keeper of the flame of Ron Dellums. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Leader Pelosi. Let me just say one thing to you in terms of just Ron's sensitivity and an example of his humanness. He was so happy you reached out to him during his last few days on this earth, and I was with him, and after he spoke with you, he had tears in his eyes, and he talked about how much he missed you and how much he loved you, and he was so grateful that you gave him that call. So thank you very much. Thank you. I'd like to now ask Congressman Lacy Clay to come forward. Now, Congressman Clay, of course, is the son of a great hero, Congressman Bill Clay, who Ron served with, but also he was so proud of Lacy because he knew Congressman Clay as a teenager, and he may want to share some of his stories about that period of time also. But thank you again for being here, Lacey.
Thank you for teeing that up, my good friend, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who succeeded my friend Ron Dellums. Ron was a giant. I truly admired him. And Mr. Speaker, I rise tonight in honored memory of a great American who served with distinction in this House for 27 years. The late gentleman from California, former Congressman Ron Dellums, like my father, former Congressman Bill Clay, Congressman Dellums will forever be revered as one of the founding members of the Congressional Black Caucus. And he was also a founding member of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Ron was a legendary figure. In whatever task he took on, he excelled in it. I first met Congressman Dellums when I was a very young man in college, and I was assigned to this chamber as an assistant doorkeeper. My door was what is known as the West Door, and I had to know Ron. I remember two instances where one time Ron Dellums portrayed the iconic figure of Frederick Douglass in a play. And I was so impressed with that. He was also a member of the congressional baseball team and played first base. But whatever he did it well. Our families became close. And when I came back to this body as a member, our professional relationship continued. And when I first met him, I was immediately impressed, not just with his powerful intellect, but with his fearless advocacy to end the war in Vietnam, protect the right to vote, speak truth to power in defense of our most vulnerable citizens, and his unyielding demand that America must be a beacon for human rights around the world. During his first run for Congress in 1970, former Vice President Spiro Agnew branded Ron Dellums as a, quote, dangerous radical for his vigorous opposition to the Vietnam War. In response to that, Ron Dellums said, and I quote, "If it's radical to oppose the insanity and cruelty of the Vietnam War, if it's radical to oppose racism and sexism and all other forms of oppression, and if it's radical to want to alleviate poverty, hunger, disease, homelessness, and other forms of human misery, then I'm proud to be called a radical." End of quote. My friends, I am proud to stand on the shoulders of Ronald Dellums as we continue the unfinished struggle to make America live up to all that we promise as a great nation. And I hope all members will join me as we send our deepest condolences to the family and give thanks for his courageous leadership. Thank you, Representative Lee, and I yield back my time.
Thank you very much, Congressman Clay, and thank you for some of the stories you shared that many of us, as a former staffer, remember. And yes, I remember Ron playing the role of Frederick Douglass, and it was unbelievable because the transformation, it didn't take much for the transformation. Sometimes we said, who is this, Ron or Frederick? So thank you for reminding us of that tonight. Now I yield to Congresswoman Jackson Lee from the great state of Texas. Ron's family actually hailed from Texas. Congresswoman Jackson Lee was a friend of Congressman Dellums. She currently serves on the Judiciary Committee, Homeland Security, Budget Committee, and also Ron was very proud of you, Shayla, and he loved hearing you speak and listening to your insights about criminal justice reform and our judiciary. So thank you again for being here tonight. Well, I'm honored to stand here with our good friends just leaving the podium, the Honorable Lacey Clay, and it is good to see the kind of family attitude that we are all expressing. Each person has gone to hug the Honorable Barbara Lee because she's the closest to Congressman Ron Dellums, and we want his family to know of the intensity of our love and respect. Congressman Lacey, you opened up the gate for me and the door for me, because I think Congressman Ron Dellums understood, as Frederick Douglass did, that where there is no struggle, there is no power. Without struggle, there is no power. And for all that he stood for, even in his early years, he had no fear of struggle. And so I stand today on the floor of the House to be able to pay tribute to our friend, and might I say our brother, and to be able to thank the gentlelady from California for her wisdom in allowing us to share this time with him. Thank you so very much for giving us this beautiful portrait for us to stand next to, and for America to be reintroduced to the Honorable Ron Dellums. Ron Dellums, member of Congress, former Bay Area Congressman and Oakland Mayor, first African-American elected to Congress from Northern California, tireless champion of racial and social justice, Marine Corps veteran and peace warrior, Congressional Black Caucus and Congressional Progressive Caucus co-founder. That is a long litany of brilliance, but as well a pioneer, legendary, brilliant, and a dynamic former chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, and the fact that he represented his constituents so ably. I'm glad as I came here as a newbie, as a new member of the United States Congress, wasn't I fortunate to get the last years of service of the Honorable Ron Dellums. I saw him as the lead Democrat on the Armed Services Committee, just missed his service as the chair of the Armed Services Committee. But as I listened to Leader Pelosi, and she will be able to tell her stories going forward as they celebrate in Oakland. And might I pay tribute to those who will celebrate, his family members who will celebrate in Oakland. And let me say to your family members, my deepest sympathy but joy for his life, and thank you for sharing him with us. But I must start with the story that I heard, which was that the appointment of Ron Dellums and Pat Schroeder to, I believe, the Armed Services Committee, as the committee was convened, and then by individuals who held themselves high and mighty, including the chairman. There was only one chair, and that chair had to be shared by the first woman and the first African American to be on that committee. Yes, can you imagine? They were told to sit in one chair. But I am grateful that through that struggle, power in his birth in 1935, power to his parents, Vernie and Willa Dellums, and all of his relatives, and as well, power in what he did in life, his engagement, his passionate commitment. They were traits of the family of Dellums. His father was a longshoreman. There lays the foundation for his love of labor. And I understand Cultrell Lawrence Dellums helped A. Philip Randolph organize the Brothers of Sleeping Car Porters, of which my grandfather was a member. He graduated from high school. He enlisted in the Marine Corps during the Cold War. But he also came back to his community, used the GI Bill. He developed a pathway for education, an Associate of Arts degree out of Oakland City College, then on to get a Bachelor of Science degree from San Francisco State. But then, what I want most of all to say is that he then carved his pathway. And Barbara Lee continues to remind us that she is a social worker. Well, Ron Dellums got his MSW from the University of California at Berkeley in 1962. Yes, this manly man, this man of mans, was a social worker that understood the needs of people who were vulnerable, a psychiatric social worker, where he worked in the Department of Mental Health, Mental Hygiene, and taught at San Francisco State. Interestingly enough, he became a council member, of which I did as well. At a young age, served only for a short time, and then at age in his 30s, went to the United States Congress and never looked back, never lost. He ran against an incumbent as an anti-war, anti-Vietnam candidate, and he won overwhelmingly. Again, there is no power without struggle. That was not a friendly place to be against the war. It was well known to follow you throughout your career. It was viewed as unpatriotic, maybe even as NFL players today are viewed as they take a kneel for issues that they believe in. But Ron Dellums was a dignified patriot. He loved his country, he loved his flag, and he came to this Congress with a love of the institution as he served on so many committees, foreign affairs. I remember the Post Office Committee because Mickey Leland was on the Post Office Committee, and they served together, and they became good friends. It's important to acknowledge them together as good friends. And I met Ron maybe for the first time as a non-elected official when Mickey brought the Congressional Black Caucus to Houston, Texas. It was a day we'll never forget. It was a day of happening. It was a day of celebration. We couldn't believe it. The Congressional Black Caucus was coming to Houston, Texas, to the Shamrock Hotel that used to be a segregated hotel, and all of us came to pay homage and tribute and honor to these congresspeople who had come to celebrate. He was of grand statute, being a member of the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and then, of course, going on to be a founder of the Congressional Black Caucus. And I stand here as the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation to express my deepest appreciation for that service and the Progressive Caucus. Ron Dellums, again, became a soldier on the battlefield for so many issues, in particular, ending and breaking the shackles of apartheid in South Africa. Remember what I started out. There is no power without struggle. He participated in that struggle, and I remember that fight, that magnificent day when he brought forward this bill in 1986 to overturn Reagan's veto, the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986. He had a congressional override where the President of the United States was vetoing the sanctions that this Congress was attempting to put forward. That was the legacy, or that was the pathway, the struggle that helped to propel the end of apartheid, the vicious cycle of apartheid in South Africa. He continued to champion Africa even after he retired. He continued to mentor and to stay around to give us inspiration, to tell us that we could do it, that we could be strong. And of course, how I remember when this Congresswoman, the Honorable Barbara Lee, came and touched all of us, and came with that inspiration and that idea and vision that Ron Dellums had about ending the horrors of HIV/AIDS in Africa, the whole idea of PEPFAR, the whole idea of the Millennium Fund. All of these were visionary ideas that came about for him to help save lives. And so, as I said, in my early years, he retired in 1998. But he then continued on to be the man that he is, being the mayor of Oakland, and being a striking mayor, truth-telling mayor, somebody that was loved and beloved by all those of which he had the privilege of serving. And then, of course, to his family, he was that giant, that husband, that father and brother, and just someone to them that they could look up to. So I thank the gentlelady for organizing this special order. And I thank this giant of a man in statute, but as well in purpose and in heart. I thank him so very much for serving his nation, but showing us what patriotism is, what the flag really means. It is the opportunity to protest, petition, and to speak to your government, and also to protest to make your government a better place. This is a great, great nation. Ron Dellums understood that. Marine Corps Ron Dellums understood that. Social worker Ron Dellums understood that. Husband, father, relative understood that. And of course, United States Congressperson Ron Dellums understood that. But never would he yield to his values, his heart, his passion, and his sense of justice just because he had a title. He believed that America's greatness was one based upon her people's willingness to challenge her and to make her the very best that she could be. My heart goes out to his family, and I continue to mourn, but I celebrate his life with joy. I yield back to the judge. Thank you, Congresswoman Jackson Lee, and thank you so much for really reminding us what a visionary and a leader Ron was. I remember when we came to Houston, Texas, Ron was determined to put together a coalition between African Americans and Latinos to look at our common issues. He and Mickey Leland were very close, and he worked very closely with the Latino community to really put together the agenda that spoke to both of our communities. So thank you very much for being here and reminding us of that. He was a coalition builder. I called him the father of coalition politics, and you laid that out tonight. Mr. Speaker, how much time do we have remaining?
6 minutes.
Okay. I'd like to come down and close. Mr. Speaker, we've heard quite a bit tonight of the life and legacy of a great human being, a great warrior for peace and justice, Congressman Ron Dellums. Let me highlight a couple of stories that weren't highlighted tonight that I would like to share. First of all, Ron really worked in a bipartisan fashion on many, many issues. And I remember that Ron and former Speaker Newt Gingrich, I remember them talking about collaborating on a book together. This was really a time of true bipartisanship. Also, Ron called himself a feminist, and he believed in equality for women. And this just wasn't lip service. He followed his convictions in his hiring practices. Ron hired women and women of color in the early 70s and took pride in employing a diverse staff. When I worked for Ron in the 70s, I was one of a very few African Americans and only a couple African American women in key senior staff positions on Capitol Hill. But he made certain that I was treated fairly and empowered me to manage his office. Ron had remarkable female role models, including his mother, Mrs. Willa Dellums. She was a major influence on Ron and taught him to be proud that he was an American of African descent. She taught him that his culture and his heritage was an important part of who he was as a human being and as an elected official. Ron was really the big brother that I never had. He gave me personal advice and support as a single mom raising two boys here in Washington, D.C. And he loved children. When my son Craig graduated from Brent Elementary School, around the corner from the Capitol, he asked Ron to be his graduation speaker. Mind you, this was, I believe, in the 6th grade. Ron left the Hill, spoke at the graduation, took pictures, and talked to the children afterwards. And mind you, these were young children. They didn't have political clout. They couldn't vote, but Ron didn't mind. He did this out of the goodness of his heart because he loved children and cared about their future. And when Ron retired, I announced my candidacy for his seat. He introduced me at my campaign kickoff, and he literally passed a blue baton to me at that kickoff, which I will cherish forever. But that baton reminds me of his impact on the world, both in the policies that he championed and in all of those he inspired to follow in his footsteps. Ron didn't serve in public office for the glory. He served to make life better for other people. He used to tell his staff, don't measure decisions by what is politically expedient. Just ask yourself, is this the right thing to do? And if it is, then go ahead and do it. You don't need to ask me about that. In his final weeks on this earth, I had the privilege to visit Ron several times and spent my birthday, July 16th, with him in the evening. He was in rare form, telling stories, toasting our friendship, and singing happy birthday to me. Yet he was frail, in pain, but all along he demonstrated a sense of hope and courage, even as he knew he would meet his maker soon. As Ron lived with dignity and respect, doing it all his way, he left this earth exhibiting courage and a sense of peace, reminding me of the scriptures. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. There is no more fitting way to honor the memory of Congressman Dellums than for us to lift his legacy in the spirit of respect for different points of views, for sticking to one's values, principles, and fighting to make this a better world for all. It's an honor of a lifetime to carry the baton which Ron passed on to me in our shared fight for justice, peace, and equality. But most importantly, as Ron said, we must secure the future for generations yet unborn. And that is what this blue baton reminds me of. Thank you again, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank all of those who have been here tonight to share the memory and celebrate the life and mourn the loss of my friend, my former boss, the great Congressman Ronald Dellums.